I don't understand, Natasha said, fighting to keep her voice level and professional despite the rage building in her chest. When we spoke on the phone 3 weeks ago, you said my initial application looked promising. You scheduled this appointment. You specifically asked me to bring all this documentation. You told me that with my credit score and revenue history, approval should be straightforward. That phone conversation had given her hope. Brad's voice had been different then, professional, even encouraging. He had reviewed her preliminary numbers and expressed genuine interest in her expansion plans. The disconnect between that conversation and this moment was jarring and deliberate. Brad leaned forward across the granite counter, his smile sharp as a blade and twice as cutting. That was before I saw you in person, sweetheart. Sometimes things look different on paper than they do in reality. Sometimes you realize you're dealing with someone who doesn't quite fit our client profile, if you know what I mean. The endearment was delivered like a slap, dripping with condescension and something darker. The implication hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore but difficult to prove. This wasn't about her qualifications or her business plan. This wasn't about risk assessment or proper documentation. This was about who belonged and who didn't, who deserved respect and who deserved public humiliation. What exactly do you mean by that? Natasha asked, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her briefcase handle. I mean, Brad said, speaking slowly like he was explaining basic concepts to a child, that First National Bank caters to a certain caliber of client. People with established family wealth, generational business connections, the kind of background that suggests stability and trustworthiness. Not someone trying to fake their way into legitimacy with borrowed clothes and big dreams that probably won't survive the first economic downturn. The insult about her clothes was particularly cruel. Every element of Natasha's appearance had been chosen with intention, from her custom-tailored suit to her elegant designer heels. She embodied executive presence with every step. Her attire was not an attempt to fit in, but a reflection of genuine success and the authority she carried. Brad's attempt to dismiss her as playing dress-up said far more about his own prejudices than about the reality standing before him. Tyler stopped counting money entirely now, abandoning any pretense of work to watch the show. Karen put down her pen and walked closer, drawn by the entertainment value of watching someone get put in their place. Other employees throughout the lobby slowed their tasks, sensing drama worth witnessing. I graduated magna cum laude from Northwestern with an MBA, Natasha said, her voice beginning to shake with controlled anger. I built my consulting business from nothing while working full-time at McKinsey & Company. I've helped over 60 companies increase their revenue by an average of 40%. I have references from Fortune 500 executives who will vouch for both my professional competence and my character. The credentials were impeccable by any objective measure. Northwestern University was hardly a diploma mill. McKinsey & Company didn't hire incompetent consultants. Fortune 500 executives didn't provide glowing references for people who couldn't deliver results. But Brad's expression didn't change. If anything, his smile grew wider and more cruel. And yet here you are, he replied with theatrical emphasis, begging for a loan because you can't afford proper office space. Telling me stories about success while dressed like you raided a clearance rack and carrying a briefcase that screams desperation rather than success. The observation about her briefcase stung not because it was true, but because it revealed Brad's determination to belittle her regardless of reality. Her briefcase was a top-tier designer piece, chosen for both its quality and presence. Brad's attempt to weaponize her image only exposed his own bias, a refusal to see success and authority in someone he had already decided didn't belong. This is discrimination, Natasha said quietly, the words carrying more power than a shout would have. Brad laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humanity. This is business, sweetheart, and business requires certain standards that go beyond what's written on paper. You don't meet them, and no amount of rehearsed talking points is going to change that fundamental reality. He bent down and began gathering the shredded papers with a theatrical flourish, making a show of dumping them into a wastebasket beside his desk. Each handful felt like another slap across her face, another denial of her worth, another assertion that her dreams were garbage suitable only for disposal. "Now, if you'll excuse me," he said, brushing his hands off dramatically like he was removing dirt, "I have real clients to attend to, people with actual collateral and legitimate business prospects who understand how professional relationships actually function." As if summoned by his words, the lobby doors opened to admit Charles Henderson III, a white man in his 40s wearing a three-piece suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Brad's entire demeanor changed instantly, his cruel smile replaced by genuine warmth and deference. "Mr. Henderson," Brad called out with enthusiasm, "so good to see you again. I have those loan documents ready for your signature. Just a formality, really, given your family's long history with the bank and your father's recommendation." The contrast was stark and intentional. Mr. Henderson hadn't brought a single document. His briefcase appeared empty except for what looked like golf magazines. He was being approved for what appeared to be a substantial loan based on nothing more than his name, his handshake, and Brad's assumptions about his worthiness. "Appreciate the expedited service, Brad," Henderson replied with the casual confidence of someone who had never been denied anything. "It's refreshing to work with a bank that understands the value of established relationships." "Of course, sir. Would you like coffee while we finalize the paperwork? I can have Tyler bring it to my private office." The offer of coffee, the private office, the deferential tone, everything that had been denied to Natasha was being offered automatically to Henderson. The message was clear. This is how real clients are treated. Natasha watched the interaction with growing clarity. This wasn't about her qualifications or her business plan. This wasn't about risk assessment or proper documentation. This was about who belonged and who didn't, who deserved respect and who deserved humiliation, who was presumed trustworthy and who was presumed fraudulent. She needed this loan for one reason: growth. Natasha had spent years building her consulting firm from the ground up, but this time was different. She was ready to take the next step, purchasing her own commercial property, establishing a permanent headquarters, and expanding into real estate development. This loan wasn't just about a bigger office. It was about creating a long-term legacy for her company and opening new doors for future ventures. It was the logical next move for any ambitious business leader, but as Natasha was being reminded, logic had little power against bias. As Henderson was escorted to the private office area with handshakes and laughter, Natasha stood alone at the counter where her shredded dreams lay scattered in the wastebasket. The humiliation was complete, witnessed by dozens of people who would now think of her as someone who had been put in her place. But humiliation, Natasha had learned from years of fighting institutional bias, could be transformed into fuel for something more powerful than revenge. It could become the foundation for justice. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out her phone, the same device that contained contacts Brad Mitchell would never imagine a woman like her could possess. "You're going to regret this," she said softly, her voice steady for the first time since entering the building. Brad raised an eyebrow without looking up from Henderson's paperwork. "Is that a threat? Because I can have security escort you out if you're going to cause a scene. We don't tolerate disruptions from disappointed applicants." "No threat," Natasha replied, her voice gaining strength as she dialed a number that would change everything. "Just a promise based on information you don't possess." The phone rang once before a crisp professional voice answered. "Klaus Acquisition Group, Nia speaking." The name of the company caused Tyler to look up with confusion. Karen Stevens paused in her conversation with another customer. Even Brad glanced over with mild curiosity, though he quickly returned his attention to Henderson's loan approval. "It's time," Natasha said simply, her voice carrying across the marble lobby with the quiet authority of someone who had just made a decision that would reshape multiple lives. "Understood, Ms. Klaus. Initiating Protocol 7. How long do you need for positioning? The professional efficiency in Nia's voice suggested this conversation had been planned, that contingencies had been prepared for exactly this scenario. Protocol 7 was not something improvised in the moment of humiliation. 30 minutes, Natasha said, looking directly at Brad, who was still focused on Henderson's paperwork. Consider it done. The legal team is standing by, acquisition documents are prepared, federal regulators have been notified, and the board of directors has been convened for an emergency session. All financial backing is confirmed and ready for immediate transfer. As Natasha hung up, she noticed that Jamal Davis, the security guard, had been watching the entire exchange with growing discomfort. He was a large black man in his 50s who had clearly witnessed similar scenes before, his expression suggesting he knew exactly what had happened but also knew he couldn't intervene without risking his own employment. Meanwhile, Brad was leading Henderson toward the private office area, his voice carrying clearly across the lobby as he continued his sales pitch. The terms are extremely favorable, Mr. Henderson. Prime rate minus 0.5%, minimal documentation requirements, and of course we can structure the payments to accommodate your cash flow preferences. The loan Henderson was receiving appeared to be larger and on better terms than what Natasha had been seeking, approved without question or documentation. The injustice was so blatant it seemed almost calculated to provoke a response. Security, Karen Stevens called out, apparently noticing that Natasha was still standing at the counter. Make sure she actually leaves the premises. We don't want her coming back and causing trouble or trying to file some frivolous complaint. Jamal approached reluctantly, his discomfort obvious. Ma'am, he said quietly, I'm sorry, but I have to ask you to leave. Natasha looked at him and saw recognition in his eyes. He knew what had just happened was wrong, but he also knew he couldn't do anything about it without risking his own job and his family's financial security. It's okay, Mr. Davis, she said, reading his name tag. I'm leaving, but I'll be back very soon. Ma'am, maybe it's better if you try a different bank, Jamal said, his voice heavy with sympathy and warning. This place, it's got its ways, and they don't change easily. Natasha smiled for the first time since entering the building, an expression that contained knowledge Jamal couldn't possibly understand. Oh, I won't be trying a different bank, Mr. Davis. I'll be coming back to this one in about 30 minutes, and when I do, things are going to be very different. She walked through the glass doors and into the Chicago afternoon, leaving behind a lobby full of people who thought they had just witnessed a woman being put in her place. What they had actually witnessed was the opening move in a game they didn't even know was being played. Behind her, Brad was already bragging to Tyler about how he'd handled the situation, his voice carrying clearly across the marble expanse. You have to be firm with people like that, he was saying, his tone suggesting he was imparting wisdom to a younger colleague. Give them an inch and they'll try to take a mile. Better to shut it down early and make the message clear before they waste more of everyone's time with unrealistic expectations. Tyler nodded eagerly, clearly impressed by what he saw as masterful handling of a difficult situation. Do you get a lot of applications like that? More than you'd think, Brad replied. People who watch too much television and think they can walk into a place like this and be treated like they belong. Part of our job is maintaining standards and making sure the right kind of people understand this is their kind of place. Karen Stevens approached with approving nods. Corporate would have our heads if we started approving loans for every wishful thinker who walks through the door with big dreams and small qualifications. Exactly, Brad replied, warming to his theme. This is First National, not some community development loan program. We have a reputation to maintain and shareholders to protect. The conversation continued with casual cruelty, each comment revealing the depth of institutional bias that went far beyond individual prejudice. This was a system designed to exclude, with employees who had been trained to see discrimination as professional competence. None of them noticed the black sedan that pulled up outside, Or the woman in the expensive suit who stepped out and made a phone call that would end careers and reshape an institution. In 30 minutes, their world would be turned upside down. In 30 minutes, they would learn that assumptions can be dangerous things. In 30 minutes, they would discover that the woman they had just humiliated owned something far more valuable than a consulting business. She owned them. Natasha Klaus sat in the back of her black sedan, parked directly across from First National Bank, and watched through tinted windows as employees went about their day, completely unaware that their lives were about to change forever. The irony was not lost on her. She was now looking at the institution from the outside, just as she had been metaphorically excluded from the inside. But the power dynamic was about to shift in ways they couldn't imagine. Her driver, Marcus Thompson, a former Marine who had worked for her for 3 years, kept the engine running while maintaining the professional silence that had made him invaluable. He had seen Natasha in various states of business intensity, but the focused calm she displayed now suggested something significant was about to happen. "Nia, give me a comprehensive status update," Natasha said into her encrypted phone, her voice betraying none of the humiliation she had endured 30 minutes earlier. "Legal team is in position. Acquisition documents have been prepared and reviewed by 3 separate law firms, and the emergency board of directors session has convened," came the crisp reply from her assistant. Regional Banking Commissioner Rebecca Martinez is personally overseeing the review process and has indicated she can expedite approval given the circumstances and our established track record with troubled institutions. Natasha had spent 3 years quietly building Klaus Acquisition Group into one of the most successful private equity firms specializing in financial institution restructuring. The company's portfolio included 7 banks across the Midwest, each one purchased when it was struggling with regulatory issues or financial instability, then systematically reformed and returned to profitability through comprehensive cultural and operational changes. But this acquisition would be different. This was personal. What about the background investigations I requested on key personnel? Completed and filed with federal regulators, the results are damning beyond our initial expectations. Nia's voice carried a note of professional disgust. Brad Mitchell has 17 documented complaints of discriminatory lending practices over the past 4 years, filed by applicants of various minority backgrounds. HR has systematically buried every single complaint, either through intimidation, payoffs, or simple administrative neglect. Natasha scrolled through the files on her tablet, her anger building with each page. This wasn't an isolated incident or a single bad actor. This was a pattern of systematic discrimination that had been enabled by institutional leadership that either didn't know or didn't care about the lives being destroyed by their employees' prejudices. Karen Stevens has been flagged by 3 different fair lending advocacy groups for suspicious patterns in loan approvals and rejections. Her branch has the highest rate of minority application rejections in the entire First National system, despite serving a diverse urban market where statistical patterns should suggest more equitable outcomes. The data was devastating. While suburban branches with predominantly white customer bases showed expected approval rates, Stevens's urban branch rejected minority applicants at rates that could only be explained by systematic bias. Tyler Roberts has been posting racist content on social media for 2 years, including memes about welfare recipients, jokes about certain neighborhoods being inherently criminal, and comments suggesting that certain ethnic groups are genetically predisposed to financial irresponsibility. Natasha shook her head in disgust. The casual racism that people felt comfortable sharing online often revealed deeper biases that affected their professional decision-making, but institutions rarely bothered to monitor or address such behavior until it became a public relations crisis. "And that's just the beginning," Nia continued. "The deeper we dig, the worse it gets. This institution has been operating as a systematic exclusion machine, while hiding behind the veneer of professional banking. Through the sedan's tinted windows, Natasha could see Brad Mitchell at his desk, probably telling the story of how he'd put an uppity black woman in her place. In 15 minutes, he'd be unemployed and blacklisted from the financial services industry permanently. What about the bank's actual financial position? Catastrophically worse than their public filings suggest. They're carrying significant losses from bad commercial loans to politically connected borrowers, the kind of loans that get approved with a handshake and no documentation while qualified minority applicants are rejected for insufficient paperwork. The irony was almost too perfect. While Brad was destroying her meticulously documented loan application, the bank was hemorrhaging money on loans approved based on nothing more than assumptions about who deserved trust. Specific numbers? 47% of their commercial loans are currently underwater or in default. They've been using creative accounting methods to hide the losses from federal regulators, but the house of cards is about to collapse. The bank is technically insolvent and operating only through regulatory forbearance that's about to expire. Natasha smiled grimly. In their eagerness to deny loans to people who looked like her, First National had been approving increasingly risky loans to maintain the appearance of profitability while actually destroying the institution's financial foundation. Henderson family exposure? Charles Henderson Sr., Jr., and III collectively owe the bank over $3.7 million in defaulted loans, all approved without proper documentation, collateral assessment, or realistic repayment analysis. Charles Henderson III, who was just approved for another loan while you were being humiliated, has personally defaulted on 4 previous loans totaling $800,000. The man who had been welcomed with coffee and private office treatment was actually one of the bank's biggest financial liabilities, but his family name and Brad's assumptions about worthiness had protected him from the scrutiny that qualified minority applicants faced. Purchase price analysis. Given their actual financial position versus their stated value, we can acquire controlling interest for approximately 60% of their stated market value. The previous owners will be lucky to avoid criminal prosecution for the accounting irregularities and regulatory violations. Through the sedan's window, Natasha watched federal banking regulators in dark suits entering the building. The preliminary investigation she'd triggered with a single phone call had found exactly what she knew they'd find: years of systematic discrimination hiding behind the facade of professional banking. Timeline for complete acquisition? Federal approval will take approximately 22 minutes given their precarious financial position, the discrimination complaints we've filed, and our established track record with troubled institution restructuring. The emergency board meeting is already in session. Previous ownership is desperate to divest before the regulatory hammer falls and potential criminal charges are filed. Natasha checked her watch. 25 minutes had passed since she left the bank in humiliation. Time to make her entrance as the new owner. Execute the acquisition immediately. I want full ownership transferred and federal approval documented before I walk back through those doors. Already in progress. Legal documents are being filed electronically as we speak. Federal regulators are on site beginning preliminary investigation. You'll have the ownership papers and federal authorization in your hands within 3 minutes. As Natasha watched, she could see confusion beginning to spread through the bank's lobby. Federal agents were speaking urgently with Karen Stevens, whose face was growing increasingly pale. Other employees were beginning to notice that something unusual was happening, though none of them yet understood the magnitude of the changes about to reshape their professional lives. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number she recognized immediately. Ms. Klaus, this is Commissioner Rebecca Martinez from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. We've completed our emergency review of your acquisition proposal for First National Bank. Given the institution's current regulatory violations, discriminatory lending practices, and financial instability, your purchase has been approved with full federal backing. Thank you, Commissioner. I'll be taking operational control immediately. We'll have a full investigative team on site within the hour to ensure a smooth transition and to begin formal investigation of the discriminatory practices and accounting irregularities your complaint triggered. Based on preliminary findings, several employees will be terminated immediately pending further investigation, and the institution will be placed under enhanced regulatory supervision until compliance is assured. Natasha stepped out of the sedan, straightened her jacket, the same jacket Brad had dismissed as clearance rack desperation, and walked back toward the bank she now owned. In her briefcase were the ownership documents, federal authorization, and personnel files that would end the careers of everyone who had participated in her humiliation. But first, she wanted to see their faces when they realized who they had been dealing with. The same security guard, Jamal Davis, was still at his post when she approached. He recognized her immediately, his eyes widening with concern and confusion. "Ma'am, I thought you left. Mr. Mitchell gave strict instructions not to let you back in if you returned. He said you might try to cause trouble or file complaints." Natasha smiled warmly at him, the same professional smile she had worn when entering the bank an hour earlier, but now backed by very different circumstances. "Mr. Mitchell no longer has the authority to make decisions about who enters this building, Mr. Davis. I do." Before Jamal could respond or fully process what she meant, Natasha walked past him toward the loan officer area where Brad was just finishing his conversation with Charles Henderson III, still celebrating his easy loan approval. "Congratulations again, Mr. Henderson," Brad was saying with the warmth he had never shown Natasha. "Your loan has been approved at terms I think you'll find very favorable. We'll have the funds transferred to your account this afternoon." "I appreciate the expedited service, Brad," Henderson replied with casual entitlement. "It's refreshing to work with a bank that understands the value of established relationships and doesn't get bogged down in unnecessary bureaucracy." The comment was clearly meant to be heard by others in the lobby, a reminder that some people received different treatment because they deserved it. Natasha approached the desk where her shredded loan application still lay in the wastebasket, a monument to institutional arrogance and prejudice that was about to become evidence in a federal investigation. "Excuse me," she said politely, her voice carrying the same professional tone she had used an hour earlier. Brad looked up with obvious irritation, his face showing recognition mixed with annoyance. "I thought I made it clear that your business is not welcome here. Security!" But Jamal hadn't moved from his position by the door. He was staring at the federal agents who were now speaking very seriously with Karen Stevens, whose body language suggested she was receiving very bad news. "I'm not here about the loan application," Natasha said calmly. "Then what do you want?" Brad snapped, his voice loud enough to carry across the lobby. "Because I have real work to do and real clients to serve." Natasha reached into her briefcase and withdrew a leather folder containing documents that would change everything. She placed them on his desk with the same deliberate precision he had used when shredding her application. "I'm here about your employment, Mr. Mitchell." She opened the folder to reveal official documents with federal seals, legal authorizations, and ownership papers that would have been impossible for Brad to imagine in the hands of the woman he had just humiliated. Brad glanced at the papers dismissively, his arrogance still intact. "What is this supposed to be? Some kind of complaint form?" "Your termination notice," Natasha said simply, her voice carrying across the marble lobby, "along with ownership transfer documents, federal authorization for immediate operational control, and documentation of discriminatory practices that constitute violations of federal fair lending laws." Karen Stevens appeared beside them, her face pale and her professional composure cracking, flanked by two federal agents whose serious expressions suggested this was not a routine visit. "Brad, we need to talk. Right now. There are some very serious allegations." "I'm busy," he replied, still not grasping the magnitude of what was happening. "Can't you see I'm dealing with this situation?" One of the federal agents stepped forward, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Agent Johnson with the Federal Reserve Investigative Division. You need to step away from your desk immediately." You're being terminated pending investigation of discriminatory lending practices, violation of federal fair housing laws, and potential conspiracy to defraud federal regulators. The color drained from Brad's face as the reality began to penetrate his consciousness. What? This is ridiculous. On whose authority? I demand to speak to corporate headquarters immediately. Natasha picked up the ownership documents and held them where he could see the official seals and signatures. On my authority, she said, her voice steady and clear. I'm the new majority owner of this financial institution. The silence that followed was deafening. Tyler stopped counting money entirely, his mouth hanging open. Other customers looked up from their transactions with expressions ranging from confusion to fascination. Even Charles Henderson paused in gathering his approved loan documents, suddenly uncertain about what he was witnessing. That's impossible, Brad whispered, his voice cracking. Actually, it's quite simple, Natasha replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. While you were busy shredding my loan application based on your assumptions about who I was and what I deserved, federal regulators were discovering that this bank has been engaged in systematic discrimination, financial mismanagement, and regulatory violations for years. I purchased controlling interest 27 minutes ago. She turned to address the entire lobby, her voice carrying clearly through the marble space and reaching every witness to her earlier humiliation. My name is Natasha Klaus. I am the founder and CEO of Klaus Acquisition Group, and as of 30 minutes ago, I am the majority owner of this financial institution. For the past 3 years, my company has specialized in acquiring and restructuring troubled banks with regulatory violations and discriminatory practices. Usually, I purchase institutions based purely on their financial potential and investment returns. Today, I purchase this one for very personal reasons. The lobby of First National Bank had transformed from a place of quiet financial transactions into something resembling a courtroom where justice was finally being served. Federal agents moved efficiently through the space, photographing documents, interviewing employees, and securing evidence of the discriminatory practices that had been standard operating procedure for years. Brad Mitchell stood frozen beside his desk, his face cycling through denial, anger, and dawning horror as the reality of his situation penetrated his consciousness. The woman he had humiliated 30 minutes ago now held his career, his reputation, and his future in her hands, backed by federal authority and institutional power he had never imagined she could possess. This has to be some kind of mistake, he said, his voice cracking with desperation. You can't just buy a bank because someone hurt your feelings. There are procedures, regulations, and oversight requirements. Natasha looked at him with the calm expression of someone who had been planning this moment for a very long time, someone who understood institutional power far better than he had given her credit for. You're absolutely right, Mr. Mitchell. I didn't buy this bank because you hurt my feelings. I bought it because you and this institution have been systematically violating federal law, discriminating against qualified borrowers, and destroying lives with your prejudice while hiding behind the facade of professional banking. What happened to me today was just the final piece of evidence in a pattern of discrimination that federal regulators have been investigating for months. Agent Johnson approached with a thick file folder that seemed to contain far more documentation than a preliminary investigation should have produced. Ms. Klaus, we've completed the initial review of lending records you requested through your federal complaint. The pattern of discrimination is extensive, well-documented, and spans multiple years. Mr. Mitchell personally rejected 63 loan applications from minority borrowers over the past 3 years, including 27 that were more qualified than loans he approved for white applicants on the same day. Brad's knees nearly buckled as the scope of the investigation became clear. This wasn't a spontaneous response to today's incident. This was the culmination of a comprehensive federal investigation that had been building a case against him and the institution for far longer than he had realized. That's not discrimination, he said desperately. That's risk assessment. That's professional judgment. That's my job as a loan officer to protect the bank's interests. Your job, Natasha said, her voice carrying the authority of ownership, was to evaluate loan applications fairly and according to established federal criteria. Instead, you've been using this institution to enforce your personal biases while hiding behind the veneer of professional banking expertise. She gestured to the wastebasket where the remains of her application still lay scattered like confetti from a celebration of prejudice. Let me give you some specific examples of your professional judgment, Mr. Mitchell. Marcus Johnson, African-American veteran with 8 years of military service, credit score of 810, an annual income of $120,000, applying for a $60,000 small business loan to open an automotive repair shop in a commercially zoned area with proven demand. You rejected his application, citing insufficient business experience. Brad's face grew paler as she continued, clearly reading from documented evidence. Same day, you approved a $90,000 loan for Bradley Henderson Jr., Charles Henderson's nephew, credit score of 640, no military service, no relevant business experience, no collateral, no detailed business plan, annual income of $65,000. The only difference was his family name and your assumption that he deserved a chance while Mr. Johnson did not. The contrast was stark and legally indefensible. Tyler Roberts, who had been eavesdropping from behind the teller counter while trying to appear busy, suddenly looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. His social media posts, now printed and in federal hands, contained years of racist comments, inappropriate jokes, and memes that would ensure he never worked in financial services again. "How long have you been planning this?" Karen Stevens asked, her voice barely above a whisper as the magnitude of the situation sank in. Natasha shook her head. "This wasn't planned, Karen. I came here today for a loan, nothing more. But when you showed me, so openly, how this institution treats qualified people like me and so many others, I couldn't walk away. I used the resources and connections I've built over the years in business to do what had to be done right now. Sometimes, enough is enough. Your actions made this happen." She walked over to where Jamal Davis stood, the security guard who had been forced to escort her out earlier despite his obvious discomfort with what he was witnessing. "Mr. Davis, you've worked here for 8 years. In that time, how many incidents like today's have you witnessed?" Jamal looked around nervously, clearly uncomfortable being put on the spot, but also recognizing that the power dynamics in the building had shifted dramatically. "Ma'am, I don't want to cause trouble for anyone. I need this job to support my family." "The trouble has already been caused by years of discriminatory practices, Mr. Davis. I'm just cleaning it up," Natasha said gently. "And I want you to know that your job is not only secure, but you're being promoted. You've seen this pattern before, haven't you?" Jamal nodded slowly, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he realized he wasn't being blamed for the institution's failures. "Yes, ma'am, more times than I can count over the years. Good people coming in, dressed professionally, paperwork in order, credit scores better than some of the approved applicants, treated like they were trying to rob the place instead of trying to do business. And when you tried to speak up or express concern, got told to mind my own business and stick to security. Was told that loan officers knew what they were doing, and it wasn't my place to question their professional judgment." Jamal's voice grew stronger as he continued. "But I saw the pattern, ma'am. Same kind of people getting rejected, same kind getting approved, regardless of what the paperwork said." Natasha turned back to Brad, who was still standing in stunned silence, his world crumbling around him. "That's the system you've been perpetuating, Mr. Mitchell. Not just denying individual loans, but creating a culture where discrimination is normalized, where good people like Mr. Davis are silenced when they witness injustice, and where assumptions about worthiness override actual qualifications." Agent Johnson returned with another folder, this one even thicker than the first. "Ms. Klaus, we've also uncovered evidence of significant accounting irregularities designed to hide the discriminatory lending patterns. The bank has been reporting false numbers to federal regulators while simultaneously approving increasingly risky loans to politically connected borrowers to maintain the illusion of profitability. Karen Stevens sank into a chair as the full scope of the investigation became clear. As a branch manager, she had been signing off on reports she knew were misleading, hoping the problems would somehow resolve themselves without regulatory intervention. The Henderson family alone owes this institution over $3.2 million in defaulted loans, Agent Johnson continued, consulting his documentation. All approved without proper documentation, collateral assessment, or realistic repayment analysis. Yet minority applicants with perfect credit were being rejected for insufficient paperwork. Charles Henderson III, who had been standing quietly with his freshly approved loan documents, suddenly looked very uncomfortable as attention turned to his family's financial relationship with the bank. "Those previous loans were approved by former management," he said quickly, trying to distance himself from the emerging scandal. "I had nothing to do with those decisions." "Actually," Natasha replied, consulting her tablet, "the most recent loan was approved by Mr. Mitchell exactly 41 minutes ago, the same loan officer who was destroying my meticulously documented application was simultaneously approving your $300,000 unsecured loan based on nothing more than your family name and his assumptions about your creditworthiness." She turned to address Henderson directly, her voice carrying the authority of ownership. "Mr. Henderson, your personal credit score is 637. You've defaulted on 4 previous loans totaling over $800,000. You provided no business plan, no collateral, and no realistic repayment strategy. Yet you were approved instantly while I was publicly humiliated despite having a credit score of 782, detailed business plans, substantial collateral, and documented revenue history." The contrast was so stark that even Henderson seemed to recognize the indefensibility of the situation. Other customers in the lobby were beginning to understand that they were witnessing the exposure of systematic institutional discrimination. "This is a witch hunt," Brad said desperately, his voice rising as panic set in. "You're destroying people's lives over a misunderstanding. I was just doing my job according to established protocols." "No, Mr. Mitchell," Natasha replied firmly, her voice carrying across the marble lobby. "You destroyed people's lives with your prejudice and your systematic violation of federal law. I'm just making sure you can't do it anymore." She walked to the center of the lobby and addressed everyone present, customers, employees, federal agents, and witnesses to both her earlier humiliation and her current vindication. "Effective immediately, this institution is implementing comprehensive policy changes. Every loan application will be reviewed by a diverse committee using standardized, objective criteria with no consideration of applicant appearance, accent, or perceived social status. Every rejection will be documented with specific, measurable reasons that can withstand federal scrutiny. Every employee will undergo comprehensive bias training and ongoing education about fair lending practices. Any future instances of discrimination will result in immediate termination and referral for federal prosecution." Agent Johnson stepped forward again, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "Mr. Mitchell, Ms. Stevens, Mr. Roberts, you're being terminated immediately for cause. Your employment records will reflect the specific reasons for termination, and you're permanently barred from working in any federally regulated financial institution. Additionally, you're being referred to the Department of Justice for possible criminal prosecution related to civil rights violations." The weight of those words hit like physical blows. For people who had built their careers in banking, it was a professional death sentence that would follow them for the rest of their working lives. "You can't do this," Karen said weakly, her voice barely audible. "I have a mortgage, children in college, 23 years of service to this institution." "You had 23 years to do the right thing," Natasha replied without sympathy. 23 years to treat people fairly, to follow federal law, to create an inclusive environment. Instead, you chose to enable and cover up discriminatory practices that destroyed dreams and violated the civil rights of countless qualified applicants. Tyler started to protest, then apparently remembered his social media history and wisely remained silent, understanding that his online behavior had created an additional layer of liability for himself and the institution. "Mr. Davis," Natasha said, turning to the security guard, "you're being promoted to Director of Security and Community Relations with a 60% salary increase and full benefits. Your new responsibilities will include ensuring that every customer is treated with respect and dignity regardless of their appearance, background, or perceived social status." Jamal's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude, clearly struggling to process the dramatic change in his circumstances. "Thank you, ma'am. I promise you won't regret this decision. I won't let you down." "I know you won't, Mr. Davis. Your integrity during a difficult situation tells me everything I need to know about your character." She then addressed the remaining employees, a mix of tellers, customer service representatives, and junior staff members who had been watching the proceedings with growing awareness that their workplace was about to change dramatically. "Everyone else has a choice to make right now. You can embrace the new culture of respect, equality, and professional excellence, or you can find employment elsewhere. But if you choose to stay, you'll be held to the highest standards of professional conduct and fair treatment for all customers." One young teller, a recent college graduate named Jennifer, raised her hand tentatively. "Ms. Klaus, what about our current customers? How do we explain what's happening here today?" "We tell them the truth, Ms. Jennifer Martinez, ma'am. Ms. Martinez, we tell them the truth. That this institution was engaging in practices that violated federal law and basic human decency, and that under new ownership, those practices have ended permanently. We tell them that we're committed to serving all customers fairly and professionally, regardless of their background or appearance." As if summoned by her words, several customers who had witnessed the earlier confrontation approached with varying expressions of discomfort, shame, and curiosity. The elderly white woman who had moved away from Natasha earlier now looked deeply embarrassed and ashamed of her behavior. "Excuse me," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I want to apologize for my behavior earlier. I should have spoken up when I saw what was happening. I should have said something when that man was treating you so badly." Natasha studied the woman's face, seeing genuine remorse and recognition of her own complicity in the system of discrimination. "What's your name, ma'am?" "Dorothy Henderson. I'm Charles Henderson's mother. I've been banking here for 37 years, and I'm ashamed to say I've seen this kind of treatment before and never spoke up." The admission carried additional weight, given her family's financial relationship with the bank and her son's preferential treatment. "Mrs. Henderson, recognition of wrong behavior is the first step toward change. Thank you for acknowledging what happened. Is there anything I can do to help make this right, to help fix what's been broken here?" Natasha considered the question, recognizing an opportunity for restorative rather than purely punitive justice. "Actually, yes. We're going to be reaching out to people who were unfairly rejected for loans over the past several years. If you hear about qualified applicants who were turned away, please encourage them to reapply under our new standards. Your voice in the community could help repair some of the damage that's been done." Mrs. Henderson nodded eagerly, clearly grateful for a chance to contribute to positive change rather than simply witness punishment. Another customer, a middle-aged black man who had been waiting in line during the earlier confrontation, stepped forward with obvious emotion. "I saw what they did to you," he said, his voice thick with recognition and shared experience. "I've been banking here for 6 years, trying to get a business loan for 3 of those years, and I've always felt like I was being watched, like I didn't belong, like I was a suspect just for walking through the door." "What's your name, sir?" "David Washington. I run a small accounting firm, have been trying to expand for years, but every time I apply for financing, there's some excuse, some additional requirement, some reason why my application isn't quite good enough." Natasha's expression softened with understanding and determination. "Mr. Washington, would you be interested in resubmitting your loan application under our new lending standards?" His eyes lit up with hope mixed with the caution that comes from years of disappointment. "You really think it might be different this time?" "I guarantee it will be different," Natasha said firmly. She turned to Jennifer Martinez. Ms. Martinez, I'm promoting you to Senior Customer Relations Specialist. Mr. Washington will be one of your first cases under the new protocols. I want his application processed fairly, thoroughly, and with the respect he should have received years ago. Jennifer nodded eagerly, clearly grateful for the opportunity to demonstrate her commitment to the new standards and her ability to treat all customers professionally. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Washington, if you'd like to have a seat, we can begin reviewing your needs right now. As David Washington took a seat at what had been Brad Mitchell's desk just over an hour earlier, the symbolism was not lost on anyone present. The same space where discrimination had been practiced and celebrated was now being used to provide opportunities that had been systematically denied for years. Agent Johnson approached with another update, his expression suggesting the investigation was uncovering even more problematic behavior than initially suspected. Ms. Klaus, we've completed the comprehensive review of loan files for the past 3 years. The pattern of discrimination is even more extensive than our preliminary investigation suggested. Minority applicants were rejected at nearly 5 times the rate of white applicants, despite having similar or superior qualifications in most cases. What about the financial impact of the approved loans that are now in default? Catastrophic for the institution's actual financial health. The bank approved high-risk loans totaling over $12 million to politically connected borrowers, many of whom had no realistic ability to repay. Meanwhile, they rejected low-risk loans to qualified minority applicants who would have been profitable long-term customers. Natasha shook her head in disgust at the sheer incompetence wrapped in discrimination. So they were losing money on their prejudice while rejecting profitable business opportunities. It's almost impressive how thoroughly they managed to fail at both ethics and economics simultaneously. Karen Stevens, still gathering her personal belongings under federal supervision, made one last desperate attempt to defend her record and minimize her culpability. We were following standard risk assessment protocols established by corporate headquarters. It's not discrimination if the applicants genuinely don't meet established requirements. Agent Johnson looked up from his files with barely concealed contempt. Ms. Stevens, David Washington was rejected for a $75,000 business expansion loan despite having a credit score of 794, 6 years of profitable business operation, and collateral worth over $100,000. The same day, you personally approved a $90,000 loan for someone with a credit score of 618, no collateral, and no documented business experience. The silence that followed was damning. There was no possible explanation for such disparate treatment except systematic discrimination based on racial bias. That's the reality of what's been happening in this institution, Natasha said to the remaining employees and customers. Qualified people with excellent credit were being rejected, while poor financial risks were approved based on family connections and assumptions about who deserved opportunities. Tyler Roberts, the young teller who was also being terminated, finally found his voice in one last attempt to minimize his culpability. Look, maybe we were a little cautious with some applicants, but that's just being responsible with the bank's money and following proper procedures. Natasha looked at him with barely contained contempt, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had thoroughly researched his behavior. Mr. Roberts, your social media posts from the past 3 years include jokes about welfare recipients, comments about certain neighborhoods being inherently dangerous, memes suggesting that certain ethnic groups are genetically predisposed to financial irresponsibility, and photographs of yourself at events celebrating Confederate heritage. That's not being responsible with money, Mr. Roberts. That's being a racist with institutional authority. Tyler's face flushed red as he realized his online behavior had been thoroughly documented and would follow him for the rest of his career in any field requiring background checks. Social media is supposed to be private, he mumbled weakly. Not when it reveals bias that directly affects your professional decision-making and violates federal civil rights laws, Agent Johnson interjected sternly. Your termination is permanent, non-negotiable, and will be reported to all relevant regulatory agencies. As the terminated employees finished gathering their belongings and were escorted from the building by federal agents, Natasha turned her attention to the immediate future of the institution and the longer-term work of cultural transformation. "Dr. Amanda Clark," she said, addressing her diversity director who had arrived with a team of institutional reform specialists, "I want you to interview every remaining employee individually within the next 48 hours. Anyone who has actively participated in or knowingly enabled discriminatory practices will be terminated immediately. Anyone who remained silent out of fear but demonstrated good character and professional integrity will receive additional training, support, and opportunities for advancement." Dr. Clark, a distinguished African-American woman with over 2 decades of experience in institutional reform and civil rights law, nodded approvingly as she surveyed the lobby that was being transformed before their eyes. "We'll also be implementing mandatory bias training for all retained staff, establishing clear reporting mechanisms for any future concerns, creating accountability measures with regular federal oversight, and developing community outreach programs to rebuild trust with populations that have been systematically excluded." Jamal Davis, still adjusting to his dramatic promotion and the complete reversal of his workplace circumstances, approached respectfully. "Ms. Klaus, what should I tell customers who ask about what happened here today? I imagine word is going to spread pretty quickly." "Tell them the truth, Mr. Davis, that this institution was engaging in illegal discriminatory practices that violated federal law and basic human decency, that those practices have been permanently ended under new ownership, and that we're committed to serving all customers fairly, professionally, and with the respect they deserve." As if summoned by her words, more customers who had witnessed various aspects of the confrontation and transformation began approaching with questions, concerns, and in some cases, their own stories of discriminatory treatment. A young Latina woman approached hesitantly, clearly nervous about speaking up but determined to share her experience. "Excuse me, Ms. Klaus, my name is Maria Santos. I applied for a small business loan here 8 months ago to expand my food truck into a restaurant. I had everything they asked for, a business plan, financial projections, collateral, and good credit, but I was rejected. The loan officer told me that restaurant businesses were too risky and that I should stick to what I knew." Natasha listened with growing anger as Maria continued her story. "But last month I saw that they approved a loan for a sports bar in the same neighborhood for someone who had never run a restaurant before. When I asked about reapplying, I was told that my situation hadn't changed and that I should try a community development organization instead." "Ms. Santos, I'd like you to speak with Ms. Martinez about resubmitting your application under our new standards. Based on what you've described, you should have been approved months ago." Maria's eyes filled with tears of relief and hope. "You really mean it? You think I might actually get approved this time?" "I don't think it, Ms. Santos. I guarantee it, assuming your qualifications are as strong as you've described. This institution is going to start serving the community it's located in, rather than excluding the people who live and work here." As Maria sat down with Jennifer Martinez to begin the application process, other customers began sharing their own experiences of discriminatory treatment, creating an impromptu testimony session about years of institutional bias. An elderly black gentleman approached with obvious emotion. "Ma'am, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I wanted to thank you for what you've done here today. My grandson tried to get a car loan here 2 years ago. Fresh out of college, good job, good credit, but they made him jump through hoops that I never saw them require for other young people. Finally went to a credit union and got approved the same day." "What's your grandson's name, sir?" "Marcus Johnson. He's doing real well now, but it hurt him to be treated like he was trying to get away with something when he was just trying to buy reliable transportation to get to work." Natasha made a note of the name, recognizing it from the discriminatory lending patterns Agent Johnson had documented. "Sir, would you ask Marcus to contact us?" We'd like to make things right, and we're also going to be offering financial education programs and preferential rates to people who were mistreated under the previous management. As the afternoon progressed, the lobby continued to fill with people who had heard about the dramatic change in ownership and wanted to witness the transformation for themselves. Word was spreading through the community that the bank that had systematically excluded minority applicants was under new management committed to fairness and inclusion. Agent Johnson approached with final paperwork and a comprehensive summary of the federal investigation. Ms. Klaus, the regulatory review is complete. You have full federal authority to restructure operations as you see fit. We'll be maintaining enhanced oversight for the next 18 months to ensure all discriminatory practices have been permanently eliminated and that the cultural changes are sustainable. Thank you, Agent Johnson. I look forward to setting a new standard for what community banking can accomplish when it's guided by fairness rather than prejudice. As the federal agents prepared to leave, taking boxes of evidence with them for potential criminal prosecution, Natasha surveyed the lobby that had been completely transformed in just over 2 hours. The marble floors and crystal chandeliers remained the same, but the atmosphere was completely different. Where there had been hostility and exclusion, there was now hope and inclusion. Where there had been systematic discrimination, there was now a commitment to equality. Where there had been an institution designed to maintain social hierarchies, there was now a bank committed to serving everyone fairly. Ms. Klaus, Jennifer Martinez called out, Mr. Washington's business expansion loan has been officially approved. Would you like to present the documents? Natasha smiled, remembering how Brad Mitchell had made such a theatrical show of destroying her application. Now she would make an equally public show of approving a loan that should have been granted years ago. Mr. Washington, on behalf of First National Bank under new management, I'm pleased to approve your business expansion loan. May this be the first of many success stories we celebrate together. As David Washington signed his loan documents with hands that shook with emotion and gratitude, spontaneous applause broke out from the customers and employees who had gathered to witness the transformation. It was a sound that had never been heard in this lobby before. The sound of justice being served, of wrongs being righted, of an institution remembering its true purpose of serving the community rather than excluding portions of it. This is just the beginning, Natasha announced to the gathered crowd. This institution will become a model for what banking can accomplish when it's guided by fairness, inclusion, and genuine commitment to community development. 1 hour after walking out in humiliation, Natasha Klaus stood behind the same marble counter where Brad Mitchell had shredded her loan application, now addressing a lobby full of federal agents, employees, customers, and community members as the rightful owner of First National Bank. The transformation was remarkable and comprehensive. What had been a space charged with hostility and institutional prejudice now buzzed with the energy of fundamental change and restoration of justice. Federal agents continued their investigation, documenting years of discriminatory practices for potential criminal prosecution, while remaining employees absorbed the reality that their workplace culture was about to be rebuilt from the ground up. Before we proceed with the complete restructuring of operations, Natasha announced to the assembled crowd, I want everyone to understand why this moment was not just inevitable, but necessary for both legal and moral reasons. She gestured to Agent Johnson, who approached with a comprehensive report that represented months of federal investigation triggered by complaints from civil rights organizations. This institution has been under federal scrutiny for over 18 months, Agent Johnson explained to the gathered audience. Multiple complaints of discriminatory lending practices, suspicious accounting methods designed to hide bias, and systematic violations of fair housing laws. The investigation accelerated dramatically when Ms. Klaus provided additional documentation and triggered today's emergency regulatory review. Karen Stevens, still in shock from her termination and the exposure of practices she had enabled for years, looked up from packing her personal belongings under federal supervision. You set us up, she said bitterly. You came in here knowing exactly what would happen, planning to use our reactions against us. I guarantee it will be different, Natasha said firmly, her voice carrying the conviction of ownership and federal backing. She turned to Denise Brown. Ms. Brown, I'm promoting you to senior loan officer with a 25% salary increase and full authority to approve qualifying applications up to $200,000. Mr. Washington will be your first case under the new protocols. I want his application processed fairly, thoroughly, and with the respect he should have received years ago. Denise nodded eagerly, clearly grateful for the opportunity to demonstrate her commitment to the new standards and her ability to evaluate applications based on merit rather than bias. Yes, ma'am, Mr. Washington. If you'd like to have a seat, we can begin the application process right now and review your business history properly. As Robert Washington took a seat at what had been Brad Mitchell's desk just 2 hours earlier, the symbolism was not lost on anyone present. The same space where discrimination had been practiced and celebrated was now being used to provide opportunities that had been systematically denied based on nothing more than racial prejudice. Agent Johnson approached with an update that revealed the scope of the institutional problems extended far beyond individual bias. Ms. Klaus, we've completed the comprehensive review of loan files, accounting practices, and regulatory compliance for the past 5 years. The pattern of discrimination is even more extensive than our initial investigation suggested, and it's been systematically covered up through manipulated reporting to federal regulators. What are the specific numbers? Minority applicants were rejected at nearly 6 times the rate of white applicants, despite having similar or superior qualifications in most measurable categories. The disparity is so significant that it cannot be explained by any legitimate risk assessment criteria. Natasha felt her anger building as the scope of the institutional discrimination became clear. What about the financial impact of the discriminatory lending practices? Catastrophic for the institution's actual financial health and community impact. The bank approved high-risk loans totaling over $15 million to politically connected borrowers who had no realistic ability to repay. Meanwhile, they rejected low-risk loans to qualified minority applicants who would have been profitable, reliable customers contributing to community economic development. Meanwhile, at Robert Washington's application review, Denise Brown was conducting the kind of thorough, respectful evaluation that should have happened years earlier. Mr. Washington, based on your credit history, documented business revenue, client testimonials, and collateral, I can pre-approve your expansion loan for $120,000 at our most competitive rate. We should have final approval within 24 hours. Robert's eyes filled with tears as the reality of fair treatment sank in. 24 hours? I've been waiting 4 years and was beginning to think it would never happen. Those days are over permanently, Natasha said, overhearing the conversation. Mr. Washington, you represent exactly the kind of qualified, hard-working entrepreneur this bank should have been supporting from the beginning. Your success will contribute to community economic development and job creation. She turned to address the lobby one more time, her voice carrying to everyone present. Let me be absolutely clear about what this acquisition means for this community. Klaus Acquisition Group doesn't just buy banks to generate profits. We acquire institutions to transform them into engines of community development, economic opportunity, and social justice. This institution will become a national model for fair lending, community investment, and financial inclusion. Agent Johnson approached with final paperwork and a comprehensive summary that would reshape how community banking was practiced. Ms. Klaus, the federal regulatory review is complete. You have full authority to restructure operations, policies, and personnel as necessary to ensure compliance with all fair lending laws. We'll be monitoring compliance closely for the next 2 years and using this transformation as a case study for regulatory best practices. Thank you, Agent Johnson. I look forward to setting a new standard for what community banking can accomplish when it serves everyone fairly rather than maintaining systems of exclusion. As the federal agents prepared to leave, taking extensive documentation for potential criminal prosecution, Natasha surveyed the lobby that had been transformed in just over 2 hours. The physical space remained elegant, Marble floors still gleamed, crystal chandeliers still cast warm light, brass fixtures still spoke of institutional stability. But everything else had changed in ways that would have been unimaginable under Brad Mitchell's reign of discriminatory practices. Where there had been hostility, there was now hope. Where there had been exclusion based on appearance and assumptions, there was now inclusion based on qualifications and fairness. Where there had been a system designed to maintain racial and economic hierarchies, there was now an institution committed to community development and equal opportunity. "Ms. Klaus," Denise Brown called out with obvious pride, "Mr. Washington's business expansion loan has been officially approved at the terms we discussed. Would you like to make the presentation?" Natasha smiled, remembering how Brad Mitchell had made such a theatrical show of destroying her application just hours earlier. Now she would make an equally public demonstration of what fair lending looked like in practice. "Mr. Washington, on behalf of First National Bank under new management and with federal backing, I'm pleased to approve your business expansion loan. May this be the first of many success stories we celebrate as this institution begins serving the community it's located in." As Robert Washington signed his loan documents with hands that shook with emotion and decades of deferred dreams finally being realized, applause broke out from the customers, employees, and community members who had gathered to witness the transformation. It was a sound that had never been heard in this lobby before. The sound of justice being served, of institutional change creating opportunity, of a bank finally fulfilling its proper role in community economic development. But this was just the beginning of a transformation that would extend far beyond one building and one day. 6 months later, the First National Bank branch on Fifth Avenue had become something unprecedented in the financial industry and a model for institutional transformation that was being studied by civil rights organizations, federal regulators, and business schools across the country. The marble floors still gleamed with the same elegance. The crystal chandeliers still cast warm, welcoming light, and the brass fixtures still spoke of institutional stability and established tradition. But everything else had changed in ways that would have been unimaginable during Brad Mitchell's reign of systematic discrimination. Natasha Klaus stood in the same lobby where she had been publicly humiliated, now addressing a packed room of community leaders, business owners, civil rights advocates, federal banking officials, academic researchers, and media representatives who had come to witness and document the unprecedented transformation of a discriminatory institution into a model of inclusive community banking. 6 months ago, I walked through these doors as a qualified loan applicant and was subjected to treatment that no person should ever experience in a professional setting, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the space to an audience that hung on every word. Today, I stand here as evidence that institutional discrimination can be defeated, that systematic change is not only possible but essential, and that financial institutions can become engines of community development rather than barriers to opportunity. The audience was diverse in every sense, representing the community that the bank had systematically excluded for years and now actively served. Robert Washington sat in the front row, his landscaping business now employing 18 people and operating from a modern facility that had transformed both his company and the economic landscape of the surrounding neighborhood. Beside him sat Maria Santos, whose food truck empire had grown into 5 brick-and-mortar restaurants employing over 60 people, all financed through the restructured bank's commitment to community development. In 6 months, this institution has approved over 400 small business loans to minority entrepreneurs who had been systematically excluded from traditional banking services, Natasha continued, consulting notes that documented the remarkable transformation. Our default rate is less than 1.7%, proving definitively that diversity and inclusion aren't just morally correct, they're financially intelligent and economically beneficial for both the institution and the community. Denise Brown, now the branch manager, after demonstrating exceptional commitment to fair lending practices, stepped forward with a comprehensive presentation that would be shared with regulatory agencies nationwide. Under Ms. Klaus's leadership, we've completely restructured our lending practices, employee training, and community engagement, Denise explained, gesturing to detailed charts and statistics that told the story of institutional transformation. Every application is now reviewed by a diverse committee using standardized, objective criteria with no consideration of applicant appearance, accent, neighborhood, or family background. We've eliminated all subjective assessments based on personal assumptions and implemented transparent processes that can withstand federal scrutiny. She pointed to a presentation board showing dramatic statistics that had caught the attention of banking regulators across the country. Loan approvals for minority applicants had increased by over 500%, while maintaining exceptional repayment rates. Customer satisfaction scores had reached the highest levels in the bank's 70-year history. Most remarkably, profitability had increased by 43% as the bank finally began serving creditworthy customers who had been excluded based on nothing more than racial prejudice and institutional bias. Dr. Amanda Clark, the Diversity and Institutional Reform Director, addressed the audience with the authority of someone who had overseen similar transformations across multiple industries. This transformation required far more than simple policy changes, Dr. Clark explained. It demanded a complete cultural revolution that challenged every assumption about who deserves financial services and why. Every employee underwent extensive bias training that included historical education about discriminatory practices, psychological training about unconscious bias, and practical training about objective evaluation criteria. She gestured to several employees in the audience who had embraced the cultural transformation. We established anonymous reporting systems with federal oversight, created accountability measures that ensure discriminatory behavior results in immediate termination, and developed community partnerships that help us understand and serve populations that had been systematically excluded. We're currently in final negotiations to acquire 6 additional banks with documented histories of discriminatory practices, Dr. Clark revealed. Each institution will undergo the same comprehensive transformation: federal oversight, complete cultural restructuring, community partnership development, and measurement of success based on community impact rather than just profit extraction. Agent Johnson, who had overseen the original federal investigation, stood to address the group with an update that demonstrated the broader regulatory impact of the First National transformation. In my 32 years of investigating financial institutions for discriminatory practices, I've never witnessed a more complete transformation of institutional culture, Agent Johnson stated. First National has gone from being a problem we were investigating to being a solution we're recommending to other banks struggling with similar compliance issues. He looked directly at Natasha with obvious respect and admiration. More significantly, this institution's transformation has influenced federal policy recommendations. We're now requiring similar comprehensive cultural assessments for any institution with statistical patterns suggesting discriminatory practices, and we're using the Klaus model as the standard for institutional remediation. As the formal presentation concluded, the lobby buzzed with conversations as people shared stories, made connections, and celebrated the unprecedented nature of what they were witnessing. The energy was electric, the kind of positive atmosphere that comes from seeing justice served and systematic change producing measurable community benefits. Robert Washington approached Natasha with obvious emotion and gratitude that had only deepened over the months of business success. Ms. Klaus, I don't know how to adequately express what you've done for me, my family, and this entire community, Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. My business has grown beyond anything I ever imagined possible. But more than the financial success, my children and grandchildren now see that hard work and good character actually do matter, that systems can change, and that justice is possible even when it seems impossible. Your success is all the gratitude I need, Mr. Washington, Natasha replied warmly. You represent everything this institution should have been supporting from the very beginning. Your business employs people from this community, serves customers throughout the region, and demonstrates that when banks serve everyone fairly, entire communities benefit. Maria Santos joined the conversation, adding her own perspective on the transformation's impact. Ms. Klaus, what you've created here goes beyond just fair lending, Maria said. You've shown that institutions can be forces for community development rather than barriers to opportunity. My restaurants employ 63 people now, most of them from this neighborhood. That's 63 families with better economic stability because you refuse to accept discrimination as normal business practice. As the evening progressed, more success stories emerged from the crowd. A young couple who had been able to buy their first home after years of being rejected by other institutions. An immigrant entrepreneur whose import business now employed 12 people and served customers across 3 states. A veteran whose auto repair shop had become a community gathering place and training center for young people interested in skilled trades. Each story represented not just individual success, but community transformation and economic development that had been systematically prevented by discriminatory practices. Dr. Clark approached with an update that demonstrated the growing national impact of the first national transformation. Ms. Klaus, we've received requests from civil rights organizations in 14 states asking us to evaluate institutions in their communities. Federal regulators in 3 regions have requested our assistance with troubled banks, and we've been invited to present our model at the National Community Banking Conference next month. Natasha nodded with satisfaction, recognizing that individual transformation was expanding into systematic change that could benefit communities across the country. The most satisfying part of all this, Natasha said, addressing the crowd one final time, isn't the financial success or the media attention or even the federal recognition. It's knowing that no one will ever again walk through these doors and be treated the way I was treated 6 months ago. As people prepared to leave, Denise Brown approached with the day's final report, a document that would be shared with federal regulators as evidence of sustainable institutional change. Ms. Klaus, we processed 68 loan applications today under our fair lending protocols. Every single application was evaluated objectively and professionally. 44 were approved based on established criteria. 24 were declined with detailed explanations and improvement suggestions. 0 complaints, 0 discrimination incidents, 0 violations of federal fair lending laws. That, Natasha said with deep satisfaction, is what success looks like in practice. Outside, the Chicago evening was warm and welcoming. The bank's exterior signage had been updated to reflect the new ownership and management, but more importantly, it now included a prominent statement that would have been unthinkable under the previous management. Equal opportunity lender, committed to serving all communities with respect and fairness. As Natasha's sedan pulled away from the curb, she reflected on the remarkable journey from public humiliation to institutional ownership, from individual discrimination to systematic change, from personal injustice to community transformation. The story that had begun with the sound of her loan application being deliberately shredded now concluded with the sound of opportunity opening for hundreds of people who had been systematically excluded from financial services. Through the sedan's window, she could see the bank's lights still glowing warmly, illuminating an institution that had been reborn with a new mission, serving everyone fairly, treating all customers with respect, and measuring success by community impact rather than discrimination. In the end, Brad Mitchell had been right about one thing. Natasha Klaus hadn't belonged in his version of First National Bank, a place where prejudice was policy and discrimination was standard practice. She belonged in charge of transforming it into something better, and that transformation had made all the difference, not just for her, but for an entire community that had been waiting for justice. 2 years after the dramatic transformation of First National Bank, Natasha Klaus stood before a joint session of Congress, invited to testify about community banking reform and the elimination of discriminatory practices in financial services. The same woman who had been publicly humiliated for seeking a business loan was now advising federal lawmakers on institutional change and economic justice. "Honorable members of Congress," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had transformed personal injustice into systematic reform. "Discrimination in financial services isn't just a civil rights issue, it's an economic development crisis that undermines community stability and national prosperity." Behind her, a presentation screen showed the remarkable statistics from the Klaus Acquisition Group's expanding portfolio of reformed financial institutions. 12 banks across 7 states, each transformed from discriminatory practices to community development engines. Over 2,000 small business loans approved for previously excluded entrepreneurs. Unemployment rates in served communities decreased by an average of 32%. Property values in targeted neighborhoods increased by an average of 18%. "When financial institutions serve everyone fairly," Natasha continued, "entire communities benefit through job creation, business development, home ownership opportunities, and economic stability that strengthens the broader regional economy." In the gallery, Robert Washington watched with pride as the woman who had transformed his business prospects testified about transforming an entire industry. His landscaping company now employed 26 people and had expanded into 3 states, contributing to economic development wherever the reformed banks had established operations. Beside him sat Maria Santos, whose restaurant empire had grown to 12 locations and was being franchised nationally with financing support from Klaus Acquisition Group banks. Next to her, dozens of other entrepreneurs whose success stories had been made possible by the elimination of discriminatory lending practices. The first national transformation wasn't an isolated success, Natasha testified. It was proof of concept for systematic institutional change that can be replicated wherever the will exists to choose community development over discrimination. As she concluded her testimony and prepared for questions from congressional representatives, Natasha reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a woman seeking a business loan to the owner of a multi-billion-dollar financial services empire dedicated to community development and economic justice. The loan application that Brad Mitchell had shredded in cruel contempt had been worth far more than he could have imagined. It had been worth the transformation of an entire industry and the creation of opportunities for thousands of people who had been systematically excluded from the American dream. In the end, discrimination hadn't just been defeated, it had been transformed into the foundation for justice, community development, and economic opportunity that strengthened everyone involved. Brad Mitchell, meanwhile, had never worked in financial services again. But that's another story entirely, and one that demonstrates that actions truly do have consequences, especially when those actions involve underestimating the power, intelligence, and determination of someone fighting for justice. The revolution in community banking that began with the sound of tearing paper had become a symphony of opportunity, playing in communities across the nation where fairness had replaced prejudice and where everyone was finally welcome to pursue their dreams.